please direct me to the American history section?
Yes, it's to the right around this post. You're
Need any help, son?
Oh, we've got a theme to write for school on any period of recent American history. Gee, I don't know what to pick.
Well, you have plenty to choose from here. Up to 1914. I guess that's pretty old stuff for us now. 1914 to 1918, the war, the first one, you know. That's not much fun. 1918 to 1930. Now, those were the days. Things were really fine. 1930, 39. Now, that's a depression. You don't want that. Well, here, the Second World War.
Oh, that's not history. I could remember that myself.
Well, look here, son. By and large, this is your best bet. Chances are you'll never live through any days like those again. No one seems to remember them except people my age, but they were our happy times. Take a look at this. Something will give you an idea how things were in the 20s.
Gee, thanks. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
I'm Frederick Lewis Allen. I'll cover the manners and customs of the 1920s.
Robert Q. Lewis. Broadway, movies, theaters, nightclubs. That's for me in any period. Alan Prescott. The lighter moments interest me. This is Red Bob. Not so old redhead. We had sports in the 20s, too. I'm Elmer Davis. I'll tell you about the political climate of the 20s. It was quite a party when we heard that the First World War of our time was over. The news of the armistice was a bit premature, but that didn't prevent a full-scale celebration in Times Square. If the Kaiser had been there, he'd have had a rough time. We blamed it all on him. But now he was licked, and most of us figured that there wouldn't be any more wars. We were ready for peace, and when the steamship George Washington moved down the North River, taking President Wilson to Europe and the peace conference, we thought the world was about to be made safe for democracy.
Yes, that's what we thought. But meanwhile, we wanted to be amused. To thrill the crowds, or maybe promote a cure for bunions, we had the daring human flies, second-story men making their way up in the world. The baseball scoreboard was easier to understand and a lot more exciting than anything happening in Europe, which, after all, was a long way off. But Europe was right with us in the latest French fashion, especially the nightgowns, which were very daring. There was a little number in mischievous satin designed for an intoxicating bride. Its lines, both modern and Parisian. Women's legs came into the open for the first time, but their heads stayed under cover. Something new came into our lives, the traffic jam. When the road was clear, you could legally do 20 miles an hour. Arguing with the cop got you nothing but a ticket. All this added up to a new age beginning, and people were ready for it. They were ready to play, too. Crowds jammed the resort, where they were amazed by the death-defying stunts of wing walkers, who never knew which end was up.
It looked as if the new airplane was going to be more than an attraction for weekend crowds. The Navy's NC-4 had flown all the way from the United States to Great Britain in only 54 flying hours. And there were the lighter-than-air craft, like the British R-34, which flew across the ocean with incredible ease. You couldn't be sure whether the future lay with the dirigible or the airplane. But anyhow, wasn't it a great future? There weren't any commercial airlines in America. But toward the end of the war, the Post Office Department had started its airmail service. And when you saw one of the little airmail planes in action and realized that aviation had plenty of brilliant wartime pilots to draw upon, men like Eddie Rickenbacker and Bert Acosta, you knew that the air age must really be coming.
At this point, the people voted for something hopefully called prohibition. And when the saloons and bars closed up early in 1920, it caused a great deal of downright grief. The trouble had started a good many years earlier, when a firm old lady named Carrie Nation had raided the saloons with a hatchet. She won, and when the Prohibition Amendment became the law of the land, enough good hard liquor went down the drain to make you feel like crying. It looked like the end, the absolute end of liquor in the United States.
By that time, the soldiers had come back to joyful welcomes, even though most of us were trying to forget the war. War heroes like Sergeant Alvin York got a big hand from the crowds, and the top brass, General Blackjack Pershing and Admiral William Sims, were showered with honorary degrees. The veterans had organized the American Legion, which held its 1921 convention in Kansas City. As usual, the Legionnaires took the town by storm. With them was a good display of generals and admirals, foreign and domestic, men whose names everyone knew, like Jacques of Belgium, Beatty of England, and of course, Pershing.
Even while the victory celebrations were going on, here and there the old belligerent spirit began to seek less worthy outlets. In a few cities, there were riots, race riots, with mobs trying to get their hands on prisoners. Nearly always, the police and National Guardsmen managed to keep the crowds under control. Others were not so easily controlled. A secret organization, the Ku Klux Klan, spread its poisonous influence throughout a large part of the country. And a man called Mr. Zero, in order to dramatize the helplessness of the jobless, held auction sales of human labor before crowds of fascinated Bostonians. The struggle between capital and labor rose to its peak in a series of prolonged and savage strikes. Prices were high. Men demanded increased wages, which many employers refused to give them. There were many war horses of labor agitation, national figures like old Mother Jones, who believed in a fight to the finish. But there were also a lot of hard-headed, practical negotiators among the leaders of organized labor, men like William Greene and Phil Murray of the United Mine Workers, and his chief, John L. Lewis. The wave of post-war strikes came to a crisis in Boston when most of the police walked out, leaving the city unguarded. A volunteer police force was formed and the militia was called out to patrol the streets. Once peaceful Boston seemed like a city under arms. Then onto the scene stepped Calvin Coolidge, governor of Massachusetts. He said, there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. That statement made Coolidge famous overnight. Not long after this, the wave of strikes died out. Public weariness, aided by a break in prices, ended it. And after a conference, labor boss Samuel Gompers and industrialist Charles Schwab managed a feeble smile together.
There was a good deal of violence during the years directly after the war. The worst damage was caused when a bomb went off in Wall Street just outside of J.P. Morgan's office. Experts examined the bomb fragments, but no one ever found out who set off the bomb, though the public believed that revolutionists were to blame. It was noted that the statue of George Washington, just across the street, escaped the blast unscathed. So did J.P. Morgan, who was vacationing in Scotland at the time. Even before the Wall Street explosion, there had been nationwide raids on communist headquarters, a result of the general belief that Bolsheviks were plotting to overthrow the government. There was not much difference in the public mind between socialists and communists, and the public seemed glad to have any type of radical brought to trial. In many cases, juries found the prisoners guilty, and then, if they were aliens, they were ordered deported. It was during this Red Scare that 2 men of Italian birth were arrested and convicted for the murder of a paymaster in South Braintree, Massachusetts. At first, the question of their guilt or innocence attracted little attention, but before they were executed years later, the case of Sacco and Vanzetti was to arouse fierce controversy throughout the world. In due course, hysteria died down, but not until hundreds of alien radicals had been started on their way home. The hysteria ended, but the melody lingered on.
If you don't like the stars in Old Glory, if you don't like the red, white, and blue, then don't act like the cur in the story. Don't bite the hand that's feeding you.
Well, that tune came straight out of vaudeville. Vaudeville was in its golden era, still a main attraction, even where films were played. A lot of the small-time, 4-a-day acts were routine but good. Big time, you saw the great stars, like Harry Houdini, never equaled in his line. The vaudeville circuit was the best training a lot of famous actors and actresses ever had. When they reached the top in vaudeville, they were in. One act, Gallagher and Shean, was so popular that crowds mobbed them after every show. There was also the question of how to spend your spare time outdoors. The seashore was not a bad place to go if you didn't mind getting slapped in the face by the ocean. Even if you did, there were compensations. Thoughtful beaches provided jazz music by bathing beauties. And there was always Atlantic City, where the policemen led the bathing beauty parade. After the cops, the girls looked good. We were just getting used to the new one-piece suits. This was the heyday of the dance hall. And when some smart operator linked jazz and marathon dancing, he had something good for the box office, although it was a bit rough on the contestants. All this didn't prevent the girls from going in for classical dancing, in which they struck highly interesting poses. Ruth St was the leader in that field. In ballet, Fokine was considered the master. Pavlova and Feodor Chaliapin, who had taken a powder out of Russia about the time the Bolsheviki took over, only fed birds for fun. For a living, Anna danced and Fedor sang. The long-haired musicians, even when they had crew haircuts like Rachmaninoff's, were sure to be popular. Paderewski not only looked like a pianist ought to look, but he was one of the few to be successful in politics, too. All the best in music came to America. Scotty Gazaza, and Enrico Caruso, the tenor.
Things weren't so harmonious on the political scene. President Wilson had brought back to Washington a peace treaty with a plan for a League of Nations, both of which met opposition at home. Wilson campaigned stubbornly for his ideas, but he became ill, and the opposition, which was centered in the powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee, managed to defeat him. The leader of the opposition was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr. Another great political event had taken place. Women had won the right to vote, and they became a political force before which the stoutest politician quailed. They had tried to invade the barber shop, but the customers thought they played too rough. In the presidential campaign of 1920, women had their first chance to vote for a president of the United States. The Republican candidate, Warren G. Harding, was a very handsome man, and he was careful to say nothing that might offend anyone. Entertainers like Al Jolson helped liven the campaign, and Harding always posed like a regular fellow. He had the august backing of Charles Evans Hughes, and the beauteous stage star of former times, Lillian Russell, plumped for Harding in an appeal to the newly enfranchised women voters. His vice presidential running mate was Calvin Coolidge, made famous by the Boston police strike, and it looked to them as though the election was in the bag. They were right. The Democratic Party's candidate, Governor James M. Cox of Ohio, and his running mate, one of the New York Roosevelts, never had a chance. The Republicans moved in on Washington with great hopes. Harding stood for a return to normalcy, a great contrast to Wilson's idealism, as they drove off to the ceremony on Capitol Hill. The voters now had an administration that was willing to take things as they came. Andrew Mellon became the Secretary of the Treasury, and under his regime, the government debt was rapidly reduced, taxes were cut, and the foundation for a new period of prosperity was laid. In that atmosphere, a great and nationwide upswing in productive work and in industrial techniques began. Everyone liked Harding, who was a friendly man, and when Gompers called to ask for the release of Eugene Debs, an imprisoned socialist leader, Harding agreed to the pardon. And Debs, who had been jailed for obstructing the conduct of the war, was freed. After all, the war was over, and the problem was to get back to normal living. National defense cost a lot of money, and armaments were thought by some people to be one of the causes of war. So Harding called for a conference for the limitation of naval armaments. In that era of good feeling, there seemed little likelihood that there would ever be another war, and the diplomats converged on Washington in high spirits. Secretary of State Hughes presided over the conference, at which the wartime allies agreed to reduce the number and limit the size of their warships. And at the time, when no threat of war existed, the agreements made appeared to be sensible and logical, even if they put the Japanese in effective control of the Western Pacific. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
But battleship decks could still be cleared for action, preferably for one of the new dances like the Black Bottom. These were pretty fancy goings-on, but after all, people were letting their hair down. The women were fascinated by Peggy Hopkins Joyce, who had a habit of getting married and divorced and married again and again. When the immigration authorities kept a visiting English actress, the Countess of Cathcart, on Ellis Island for alleged moral turpitude, it sounded as though the Countess was up to something special, although the charges were later dismissed. The jazz age began to get interesting. The girls stopped wearing corsets and began to dance in a friendly way. The younger generation discovered that sex and autos went well together, and the pulp magazines confirmed the discovery.
Hollywood knew all about that angle. Why, someone cooked up an audience reaction meter to test the voltage given off by Rudolph Valentino clinching with Vilma Banky. The love meter almost blew a fuse. Things got so hot in the movies that the reputable producers signed up Will Hayes at $100 grand a year to clean up the picture business and yet keep the busybodies off the industry's neck. Anxious reformers thought the movies were overselling girls. Well, maybe they were, but they had some beauties. Gloria Swanson was one lovely no one could ever forget. And when she turned up on an incoming liner with a new husband, this time a French marquis, well, no one bothered about the rest of the passengers. John Barrymore and Dolores Costello were members of the royalty of stage and screen. And even more than that, great box office. But the star who really laid him in the aisles was Rudolph Valentino, the great lover. There are fans who will never forget him, and Broadway will never forget his funeral. They had to call out all the cops, and even then, it was almost a riot. Paula Negri was there, and the honorary pallbearers included all the brass from Hollywood. Dead or alive, Valentino had made history in the growth of American movies. As a matter of fact, everything that happened to a star was important. The fans went gaga when the romance of Rod Larocque and Vilma Banky ended just like in the pictures. As a comedian, Charlie Chaplin was already the old master. Douglas Fairbanks was the kids' hero. But as a screen couple, none could surpass Garbo and Gilbert. wasn't all sex. There was Will Rogers, who had a homespun quality that no one has ever been able to match. Will came up the hard way, through the vaudeville circuit.
Well, all I know is what I read in the paper.
But it was Al Jolson who had first cracked things wide open for the new sound movies when he starred in The Jazz Singer.
Make your way. Mary, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late. Mary, don't you know me? It's a little baby. I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. For my
The thing that really wrung the heart was Prohibition. 13 long years of it. That beer they used to make tasted like no beer on earth in the first place. And then, when they spiked it with alcohol and ether, you needed some support. Flasks were worn in the best circles, and you just didn't criticize what a man's bootlegger had sold him, even if it almost killed you to drink the stuff.
The most disturbing thing about Prohibition was the contribution it made to general lawlessness. There were, of course, a lot of notorious criminals in the early 20s, like Gerald Chapman, who had no connection with the traffic in illegal liquor. Chapman had murdered a policeman in Connecticut, and when he was brought to trial, no one thought of him as a big man. He was just another bandit with a twisted mind, and he was condemned to death. But in many American cities, especially Chicago, gangs of hoodlums in the pay of wealthy bootleggers might be arrested, but it was sure they would be as quickly freed. Chicago's mayor at this time was Big Bill Thompson, a greedy politician who was less interested in curbing the gangsters than in holding office. He got himself re-elected in one campaign on the slogan, "Bust King George in the Snoot," a slogan which, after all, didn't have much to do with conditions in the city of Chicago. While Big Bill was mayor, a gangster named Al Capone ruled as undisputed boss of the Chicago underworld. When he was jailed, years later, it was for income tax evasion. But crime was abhorrent to most American citizens, millions of whom were wholehearted churchgoers. There were great numbers of people whose religious instincts were stirred by the emotional exaltation of Billy Sunday, a ball player who had become a famous evangelist. When Billy pitched the gospel, a congregation never forgot it. Brightening the twilight zone between faith and science was Emile Coue, a French pharmacist who taught that one grew in strength by chanting, "Every day and every way I'm getting better and better." And when the Austrian surgeon, Dr. Adolf Lorenz, demonstrated his bloodless surgery technique in America, his work met with wide approval. Science was leaping forward. Madame Curie, already famed co-discoverer of radium, arrived to accept a gift of a gram of the magical metal about which so little was then known and whose full possibilities were not imagined. And Thomas Edison, now old and deaf, basked in the respect of everyone for his invention of the incandescent electric light, a scientific milestone.